What if you had to survive winter with no glass windows, no insulation, no furnace, only a fragile fire keeping you alive until morning? Imagine opening your eyes before sunrise. The room is dark. The roof above you is blackened with years of smoke. Frost has formed where cold air finds its way through the walls. Your breath is visible. Somewhere nearby, an animal shifts its weight against the straw. The fire in the center of the room has collapsed into a bed of glowing embers. Outside, winter is still waiting. For millions of rural Europeans, this was not an extraordinary survival scenario. It was part of ordinary life. Between roughly the 9th and 15th centuries, rural communities across northern and central Europe developed an entire system for surviving winter without anything resembling modern heating. The exact buildings, foods, clothing, and customs differed from England to Scandinavia, from Germany to Poland, from France to Eastern Europe. But the underlying problem was remarkably similar. How do you preserve heat when you cannot manufacture very much of it? And the answer was not simply fire. It was architecture. It was food. It was animals. It was clothing. It was timing. And perhaps most importantly, it was the management of resources months before winter became dangerous. Because the greatest threat was not always the coldest night. Sometimes the real enemy arrived much later. And by the time a medieval family recognized it, there might be almost nothing left to fight it with. Look at a reconstructed medieval peasant house, and it can appear almost absurdly fragile. Timber frame, mud, thatch, packed earth, a few small openings. Nothing about it looks like a modern shelter designed to resist winter. But that is the wrong way to read it. A medieval rural house was not designed to impress the eye. It was designed around available materials and repeated experience. At sites such as Warham Percy in England, archaeologists have found evidence for numerous peasant houses arranged within a planned medieval settlement, including substantial longhouses. At Hound Tor, excavated longhouses reveal something even more revealing. The building itself was divided according to the needs of both people and livestock. That arrangement mattered. A longhouse could combine living space, working space, storage, and animal space under one roof. The animals were not simply tolerated because medieval people had nowhere else to put them. In some regions, overwintering valuable livestock indoors protected animals from severe weather and predators while allowing the household to monitor them. And there was another advantage: heat. A large animal is a living heat source, not a furnace, not a replacement for a fire, but a steady source of metabolic heat inside an enclosed structure. This meant the house could function as a thermal system in which every part contributed something. The walls slowed wind. The thatched roof trapped layers of relatively still air. The earth floor absorbed and released heat. The fire supplied concentrated warmth. The animals added body heat. And human bodies themselves became part of the equation. This is the first major shift in perspective. The medieval house was not trying to make winter disappear. It was trying to slow down the rate at which heat escaped. That distinction is everything. Because when energy is scarce, survival depends less on producing endless heat than on losing as little of it as possible. And this explains why some of the simplest-looking materials in medieval construction were so important. A timber wall with gaps between the logs is a terrible shelter. A timber wall with those gaps deliberately packed is something very different. Across medieval Europe, construction techniques varied enormously. Timber framing, wattle and daub, clay, cob, stone, turf, and other local materials all appeared in different regions. But the principle was often familiar. Create barriers against wind, and create spaces where air cannot move freely. Wattle and daub is a perfect example. A framework of woven branches could be covered with a mixture containing clay or earth and fibrous material such as straw. Once dried, the wall became a much more effective barrier than the bare framework beneath it. Archaeological remains and surviving medieval structures show how extensively wattle and daub was used. And plant remains preserved within daub can even provide clues about agricultural activity and the materials available to medieval builders. Then, there was the roof. To modernize, thatch looks dangerously flammable and vulnerable. But a properly constructed thatched roof was also a thick layer of trapped air and dry plant material, separating the living space from the weather. And here the archaeological record gives us an extraordinary clue. In surviving medieval buildings, roof timbers, rafters, battens, and even portions of thatch can remain heavily blackened by smoke. Some halls were open to the roof for long periods, with the smoke moving upward through the structure rather than being immediately carried away by a modern chimney. The result was a building that behaved very differently from a modern room. Heat rose, smoke rose. The upper part of the building could become a reservoir of warm, smoky air, while the lower living zone remained the most useful space for people. And the smoke left a permanent signature on the building. But there was a hidden cost. The same system that helped manage heat could fill the interior with smoke. So why would anyone accept that? Because for centuries, the alternatives were limited. And the fire itself had another job that went far beyond warmth. In many early medieval rural houses, the hearth was not an elegant fireplace. It was a fire on or near the floor. The room itself became the fireplace. Archaeological evidence from medieval buildings shows open hearths and extensive smoke blackening of roof structures. In some surviving examples, the evidence suggests that smoke moved freely through an open hall before later architectural changes introduced more enclosed fireplaces and chimneys. That changes the atmosphere completely. Picture the room at night. The flames are low. The walls are barely visible. Smoke hangs beneath the roof. The family sits or lies close enough to feel the heat, but far enough away to avoid the sparks. And someone is watching the embers. Because a fire was not simply something you turned on. It had to be maintained. Wood had to be collected, split, dried, stored, and rationed. During the coldest part of the year, every log represented labor that had already been performed months earlier. This is why preparing for winter began long before winter arrived. A household that entered December with insufficient fuel had already made its mistake in summer. And at night, the objective was not necessarily to keep a roaring fire burning until morning. The goal could be to preserve embers. Ash could be pulled over the remaining coals, slowing combustion and allowing the household to attempt a restart in the morning. If the embers survived, the day could begin with heat. If they died completely, restarting the fire meant another problem. No match, no lighter, no instant flame. Only the technology of the period: tinder, sparks, dry material, patience, and skill. And this leads to a strange truth about medieval survival. A fire could be more valuable than it looked. Because the fire did not just warm the house. It transformed food. It dried materials. It boiled water. It provided light. It allowed people to work. And in the morning, it gave the household its first advantage against the cold. But fire alone could not save a family whose food reserves were disappearing. That was where winter became a mathematical problem. The medieval peasant did not enter winter with a supermarket. There was no warehouse down the road. There was no truck arriving with fresh food. What was harvested in one season had to carry people, animals, and sometimes seed stock through months of scarcity. At Hound Tor, archaeologists found evidence of oats and rye being cultivated around the medieval settlement, along with barns used for processing, drying, and storing grain. This tells us something important. Winter survival began with storage. Grain could be transformed into bread or porridge. Roots could be stored. Beans and peas could provide valuable nutrition. Dairy products could be preserved in forms suited to local traditions. Meat could be salted, smoked, dried, or otherwise preserved. And animals themselves represented stored biological wealth. A pig was not merely an animal wandering around a village. It was a future supply of meat and fat. Slaughtering livestock at the right time could convert a living animal into preserved food. But keeping an animal alive also had value. It could provide milk. It could reproduce. And in some houses, livestock could contribute body heat during the winter. Every decision, therefore, carried a cost. Do you feed the animal through another month? Or slaughter it now? Do you burn another log tonight? Or save it for February? Do you open another grain sack? Or protect it for later? These decisions were not theoretical. They determined whether a household reached spring with enough food and fuel. And the food itself was designed around one brutal requirement: maximum usefulness from limited resources. Bread could be made from grains that were less desirable to elites, but perfectly suited to rural survival. Broths could turn bones, vegetables, grains, and scraps into hot meals. Rendered animal fat provided concentrated energy. The medieval winter diet was not built around variety. It was built around endurance. And there was another reason fat mattered. The body itself was consuming energy simply to remain alive in the cold. Modern people often imagine cold survival as a battle between the body and the environment. For medieval peasants, the body was also a resource that had to be managed. Clothing was the first line of defense. Linen could be worn close to the skin. Wool provided insulation. Outer layers protected against wind and moisture. Fur was available in regions and social groups where the necessary animals and resources existed. The exact clothing system varied dramatically across Europe, but the principle of layering was powerful. Instead of relying on a single thick garment, multiple layers created pockets of relatively still air. And wool had another useful characteristic. It could retain insulating properties even when damp, making it particularly valuable in wet, cold climates. The feet received special attention because contact with frozen ground could drain heat rapidly. Straw, wool scraps, moss, felt, and other locally available materials could be used inside footwear, depending on region and period. Hands were protected with gloves or mittens. The head and neck were covered, because a person could survive a cold room more effectively if the body was wrapped before trying to heat the room. This is another principle that keeps appearing. The medieval solution was rarely one spectacular invention. It was dozens of small improvements working together. The house slowed heat loss. Clothing slowed heat loss from the body. Food supplied energy. The fire supplied external heat. Animals added another source of warmth. And sleeping arrangements could conserve even more. Families often lived in extremely compressed spaces. Privacy was limited, but warmth was valuable. Sleeping beneath layers of textiles and animal skins, close to other people, reduced the amount of exposed surface area and allowed body heat to accumulate. It was not comfortable by modern standards. But survival systems do not have to be comfortable. They only have to work. And yet, even a perfectly managed house and a well-fed body could lose the winter battle if one resource ran out. That resource was time. Here is where the story changes. Imagine November. The harvest has recently ended. The granary is full. The family has stored fuel. The animals still have weight. The household is tired, but hopeful. Winter feels dangerous, but manageable. Now imagine February. The same family has been eating for months. The woodpile is smaller. The animals have consumed enormous quantities of stored feed. The family has burned fuel night after night. The grain supply has declined. Clothing has been repaired repeatedly. The body has spent months living under nutritional and environmental stress. The new harvest is still far away. This is the real danger of a long winter. Not one terrible night. Accumulation. A single cold night can be survived. 100 ordinary cold nights can slowly consume everything. This is why medieval agriculture was inseparable from survival. A poor harvest did not merely mean less food. It meant less feed for animals, less fuel, less seed, less trade capacity, less ability to recover from illness, and less margin for error. Archaeological and historical evidence from medieval villages shows that rural communities were deeply dependent on seasonal agricultural cycles. Houndtor, for example, reveals a settlement built around cereal cultivation and livestock, while Warham Percy preserves the physical layout of a larger peasant community with houses, barns, and agricultural plots. The medieval winter, therefore, cannot be understood as simply people trying not to freeze. It was a resource management problem, extending across an entire year. The household that survived was often the household that had planned months earlier. And when individual households failed, the village itself could become the final safety net. One of the greatest mistakes we can make is imagining medieval survival as an individual family fighting nature alone. Medieval villages were social systems. People exchanged labor. They traded food. They shared knowledge. They borrowed. They depended on neighbors. They depended on local markets. And in times of scarcity, relationships could become as important as possessions. A household might own little livestock, but possess labor. Another might have grain. Another might have tools. Another might have access to pasture or woodland. Another might have skills that were valuable during slaughter, building, spinning, weaving, or repair. The village was therefore more than a collection of houses. It was a network of resources. That network could also determine who was vulnerable. A household isolated from its neighbors had fewer options when something went wrong. An illness could remove a worker. A dead animal could eliminate a food reserve. A failed crop could leave a family dependent on exchange. A fire could destroy stored fuel. And winter magnified every weakness. This is why medieval survival cannot be reduced to strong people survived and weak people died. Strength mattered, but cooperation mattered too. Knowledge mattered, timing mattered, and luck mattered enormously. The surviving archaeological landscapes make this visible. At Warham Percy, the remains of dozens of peasant properties show that medieval rural life was organized at the settlement level, with homes, barns, fields, and shared infrastructure forming a larger agricultural system. Even the shape of a house could reveal social and economic decisions. And inside that house, the nightly routine became another carefully repeated system. When darkness arrived early, there was little reason to waste scarce fuel pretending it was daytime. In Northern Europe, winter transformed time itself. The days became short. Work that required daylight had to be completed earlier. The fire became the main source of light. People repaired clothing, processed fiber, prepared food, maintained tools, cared for animals, talked, prayed, and slept. The house became a world separated from the darkness outside. But it was not necessarily peaceful. The animals moved. The roof creaked. Wind pressed against the walls. Smoke lingered overhead. The fire slowly collapsed. Someone eventually had to wake. Check the embers. Adjust the fuel. Listen for animals. Perhaps tend a child. Then sleep again. This repeated rhythm reveals something profound about pre-modern life. The absence of modern technology did not mean the absence of systems. It meant the systems were embodied in habits. Nobody needed a thermostat to know the house was getting too cold. Nobody needed a weather app to understand that the wind had shifted. Nobody needed an energy monitor to know the woodpile was disappearing. The household could see the fuel. They could feel the cold. They could count the remaining sacks. And they could compare the present winter with winters remembered by parents and grandparents. Knowledge lived in memory. It lived in architecture. It lived in recipes. It lived in clothing. It lived in the way fire was built. It lived in where animals were kept. And it lived in the calendar. Winter was not simply a season. It was a test of everything the household had learned during the rest of the year. But there was still one final piece of the puzzle. Because all of these strategies could work together and still fail if people misunderstood the fundamental problem. The objective was never to make a medieval house warm by modern standards. The objective was to make it survivable. Now return to that house. The same house from the beginning. Outside, the wind is striking the walls. Inside, the fire has burned down. Smoke hangs beneath the roof. An animal shifts in the adjoining space. A child sleeps beneath layers of wool and rough fabric. An adult reaches toward the embers. There is no thermostat, no electric light, no furnace, no insulated window, no emergency service waiting outside. And yet the household has survived another night. Not because one invention saved them, because dozens of small decisions worked together. The roof slowed heat loss. The walls blocked wind. The earth beneath their feet stored and redistributed heat. The hearth transformed wood into warmth and food. The animals provided food, labor, and in some settings additional warmth. Wool protected the body. Fat and grain supplied energy. Preserved food carried the harvest into the lean months. The village provided exchange, labor, and social insurance. And the calendar told them when to conserve. This is the part that is easiest to miss when we look at medieval people through modern eyes. They were not trying to live as comfortably as we do. They were trying to live within the limits of the world they had. And they became extraordinarily good at it. The evidence from medieval settlements and surviving structures does not show one universal European survival house. It shows regional adaptation, different materials, different layouts, different crops, different livestock systems, and different ways of handling smoke, heat, food, and shelter. The system was imperfect. People still froze. People still starved. Children still died. Bad harvests still became disasters. And a long winter could destroy a household despite every precaution. But the ingenuity lies precisely there. Survival was not guaranteed. It had to be managed. And that brings us back to the question from the beginning. What if you had to survive a winter without modern heating? Perhaps the most surprising answer is that the medieval peasant did not survive because the house was warm. The house was often cold. They survived because everything around them was designed to make that cold just a little less dangerous. The wall, the roof, the fire, the animal, the wool, the grain, the stored fat, the sleeping family, the neighbor, the memory of the previous winter, and the discipline to save something today for a month when there might be nothing left. That was the real technology, not a machine, a system refined through generations of failure, adaptation, observation, and survival. And perhaps that is the question worth leaving you with. If you were placed inside one of these medieval houses tonight, what would break you first? The cold? The smoke? The darkness? The hunger? Or the knowledge that every log you burn and every handful of grain you eat brings spring one day closer, but also brings your reserves one step closer to running out? If this story changed the way you see the people who lived through Europe's hardest winters, stay with Dark Origins. Because sometimes the most remarkable technology in history isn't something ancient people invented. It's something they learned to do without. And sometimes, the deeper we look into the past, the more we realize that survival was never about conquering nature. It was about understanding it well enough to endure another night.